Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this lunch briefing on the challenges of democratic trends in Africa. My name is Christine Lutringer from the Graduate Institute Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy, and I have the pleasure to moderate the debate today. And I'm glad to introduce our speaker, Degila, Professor of Practice of International Relations at the Geneva Graduate Institute. A political scientist and lawyer, Professor Degila's research interests range from international politics to state building in the Global South and African peace and security challenges. He is conducting a long-term project on the role of African states in contemporary global governance. Professor Degila is active in several academic organizations, including the International Studies Association, and he serves as member of several advisory boards on global scale. He advises governments and international organizations such as the African Union, l'Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, West African Economic and Monetary Union, and the United Nations. His latest book, Governing Migration for Developments from the Global Souths, with Valeria Valle, puts a particular emphasis on human mobility as a driver for development and social progress. Human mobility and demography are two themes he will discuss today in his briefing on the challenges of democratic trends in Africa. It is a great opportunity for us to be able to interact with you during this lunch briefing. The format is as follows, about 30 minutes presentation, and then we will open the floor for Q&As. We will finish the session at 1:30. And for those who are joining online, you can write your questions in the Q&A chat box of WebEx. You can also ask your questions and make your comments either in French or English. So with no further ado, Eric, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, at the start of this new academic year, I'm very pleased to deliver my address today on the challenges of demographic trends in Africa. And I would like to warmly thank my colleagues, Madame Sophie Fleury, Dan Graham, and the team for their support in organizing this event. Et merci à Christine Lutringer pour sa modération. And I would like also to thank the participants online, particularly those from Africa. This is a great opportunity when we do hybrid events. We can really connect with all over the world. Africa is the world's fastest urbanizing region with an exponential growth of its youth population. By 2050, 1/3 of youth population around the world will be African. At the same time, a dominant trend in the region is the mutation of the security landscape with the resurgence of hybrid and asymmetric security threats, particularly transnational terrorism, but also issues such as piracy. We know how, for example, Boko Haram Jenin, Al-Shabaab, and all these non-state entrepreneurs of insecurity are creating a lot of challenges in the region. But the favorable demographic dividend in Africa is often presented as an asset, and it is a great one. But how can we apprehend the issue of youth in the region where we situate it in the broad perspective of the making of modern African states? How can we reflect on a popular support that some African youth expressed these last months and year to recent coups in the region? These are the main questions that I would like to discuss with you today. And we can also ask if we are going through an historical shift in the region related to the state building process in Africa. Africa is huge and complex. Here you can put the United States, you can add Europe, you can even add China, India, and you still have space. Africa is also physically diverse. And you can see how the geographic configuration of the continent is unique. So what are we talking about when we refer to the favorable dividend trend or demographic dividend in Africa? Perhaps I should remind us that the notion of demographic dividend refers to the economic growth produced by a change in the age structure of a country's population. It is actually a socio-economic configuration where labor forces of a country grow more rapidly than the dependent population. In principle, such situation frees up resources for investment and welfare and sustainable development. This is what we are talking about when we refer to demographic dividend. As you can see, by 2050, Africa will be in a very positive situation, with more than 1.3 billion young working age people in its sub-Saharan part, and most of them living in urban settings. This is great, but it comes with complex challenges. Before I discuss what I term the Janus phase of demographic dividend in Africa, allow me to situate in which institutional framework we are today by saying a few words on the state building process in Africa. And this is just to remind what we are talking about. Modern African states are the byproduct of a unique trajectory. And I would like to remind us here three main points. I'm sure all of you know that. The first one is the colonial experience. A colonial experience which led to the destruction of indigenous political organizations. Remember that before the colonial power came in Africa, there were several forms of political organizations, and here I can mention For example, the Empire of Ghana, the Kingdom of Benin, my native country, the Empire of Mali, the Empire of Soso, etc. First point to keep in mind. Second one is the Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, which led to what we call in the discipline the Balkanization of Africa. When Otto von Bismarck organized this conference, no African leader were invited to discuss what will become the future border of what we have today as modern African states. Third point, the decolonization and independence, 1950, 1960s, which produced what we have today as Westphalian political entities, recognized as a modern African state with this principle of uti possidetis juris. So we keep the border we inherited from the colonial experience. These are historical facts. But unique trajectory which led to the emergence of so-called artificial political organization in the region, to the point that some of my colleagues, political scientists, stated that African state is neither a state nor African. And here I refer to Pierre Englebert and others. We have two distinguished African ambassadors coming. Welcome. So what are we talking about? As I mentioned, to better capture demographic trends in the region, it is crucial to really look at the institutions which host the so-called demographic dividend. And I would like to develop my analysis, ladies and gentlemen, by using the specific metaphor of Janus, which expresses a dual dimension of a reality. And to save the time, I will focus on 5 main points, because I would like to engage with you. And the first one will be to discuss indeed favorable dimensions of demographic trends in Africa. For example, how the youth population can be a driver for the IFTCA, which is a new regional framework in Africa. But I would like also to underline, and this is our privilege in academia, challenges and where problems are, by looking at issues of structural violence and bad governance. That will be my second point. I will discuss the challenge of waitwood, developed by my colleague Oana. Then I will move to the issue of rural exodus and urbanization, and finally share some views on climate migration and eco-sectarianism, which are becoming more and more concerning issues in the region. So, positive drivers. Yes, African youth represent a great asset for the continent in terms of workforce, innovation, creativity. You cannot imagine how African youth are so committed to including social innovation. There is no need to mention multiple commitments, and I'm particularly pleased to see, for example, here some African students, the future, who are very, very committed to provide positive perspective on Africa. A demographic trend in Africa is also a great potential in terms of boosting the economy. And I mentioned the AfTCA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is a unique institutional achievement for development progress. And actually, if it's work well, it will become the largest market around the world. So we have their positive opportunities to take profit of African youth. And it is reassuring to see that the African Union, the regional organization, places youth as a critical component. But, and now I start the freedom I got when I moved from diplomacy, I start to talk about challenging points, because political leaders must walk the talk. Challenges of structural violence, bad governance, that I see as the first concerning point regarding how youth and demographic dividend can become a time bomb. And the first challenge is about the prevalence of contexts where the negative impact produced by social structures in a context of inequalities push for the lack of basic human needs. In the region, it's quite easy to identify context of structural violence by looking at the lack of basic duties a state must provide to its population. Access to health, education, clean water, housing, security. When you are in this configuration, then you face a situation of structural violence. And obviously, such contexts can produce, promote, and complicate asymmetric and hybrid security, particularly because youth may be very easily attracted by the trap of such negative environment. 2 years ago, I published a piece on the hybridization of security challenges in Africa, where I underlined the fact that youth population in Africa which join violent extremist groups are not doing so for ideological or religious motivation, but because of context of structural violence. These youth join, for example, in the northern part of Burkina Faso, terrorist group, because it is for them an economic opportunity to just have a sort of job and try to exist with dignity. Now I move to another concerning point, which is about the trap of waitwood. So what is it? The concept of waitwood describes the prolonged and precarious period young Africans experience between childhood and adulthood. And here I refer to the work of Owana. Waitwood actually is when young people are no longer children, but not yet independent adults. And independent adult comes with the possibility to find a job, to get married, to have hope, to exist, to live with dignity, and to be just part of the civitas, not just a group of marginalized. So this issue of waitwood fuel grievances and maybe ease and make really become a concerning problem in the region vis-à-vis how youth population may select the wrong pathway. youth transitions to adulthood become for them in that context uncertain, and so they may select the deadly illegal project. And I will not mention what you all hear in the news about Lampedusa these last weeks. But yes, we need to address the migration issues in a very, very nuanced perspective. We can discuss it further. Another critical issue connected to the previous one is the issue of urbanization and rural exodus. We tend to talk about migration, African migrant trying to come in the so-called Western El Dorado, but within the continent there are a lot of mobility, and within each country you have this phenomenon of rural exodus from rural places to cities, which comes because the world fastest urbanizing region is Africa. So you have a lot of flows of people coming from remote places to cities, and this is challenging and create what Muga and Valle termed the issue of fragile cities. Fragile cities defined as an emerging category of a social disorder. When cities receive a large number of people, particularly young, without infrastructure, without real opportunities, then it becomes a problem. A problem that can fuel also conflict dynamics, because when you have no economic opportunity, job opportunities, then you can easily become violent. You see that there is a growing tendency in Africa of what is termed urbanization of violence, which involve youth actually as key agents. But the problem is these trends happen in context of bad governance. And I will come back on this issue later. My fifth point is the growing issue of climate migration and eco-sectarianism. Today, there is an increased number of IDPs worldwide, but particularly in Africa, you have a lot of IDPs and climate-induced migrants. By 2050, 143 million climate migrants will be in Africa, and more than half will be youth. In 2022, more than 4.4 million people leave their home countries in the region due to natural disaster, climate change, and induced effect. For UNHCR, Africa counted last year more than 25 million of IDPs. So the problem is that this forced migration, this type of forced migration, may become challenging, particularly when you are in a context of multicultural dynamics. And I would like to propose the theoretical framework of eco-sectarianism to address this critical issue. Eco-sectarianism is the politicization of intra-religious binaries in fragmented ethno-religious societies, and it is the case everywhere in Africa, when man-made or natural ecological problems such as famine, water scarcity, regenerate sectarian narratives and deepen social division. These concepts underline how ecological issues can intensify the rise of militant sectarianism, particularly with youth. You know, when you are in a difficult situation, it is very easy to sell you any ideology or doctrine saying that your neighbor is a problem because your neighbor is different from you in terms of identity. So this issue is more and more challenging. But an important conducive factor here is a lack of education. If youth are not well educated to be able to have a nuanced perspective on all these issues, they can easily be instrumentalized to follow eco-sectarianism dynamics. So, you all know that over the last months, there are issues of coup. I would like to say a few words on this political development in the region. And military coup question how democracy have been often understood and implemented in Africa, which is basically democracy means elections. Such simplistic approach neglects important aspects of the making of a sustainable state apparatus, such as the separation of powers and freedom of expression, independence of justice, and so on, and provides space for the negative practices, such as what I term plebiscitarian neo-patrimonialism, which is a strategy to legitimize patrimonial regime through elections. And I will tell you that what happened a few weeks ago in Gabon is a paradigmatic illustration of this plebiscitarian neo-patrimonialism. And today, in Africa, but anywhere else, there are two critical challenges related to the building of sustainable civitas. Beyond a performance perspective, the first one is legitimacy, and the second one is accountability. African youth today have more expectations on these issues, rule of law, good governance, than ever. And I see an historical turning point, but we need to be cautious with, and I come back to my metaphor of Janus, we need to be cautious about misinformation and instrumentalization. At the same time, yes, youth have high expectation in terms of elections, good elections in good conditions, accountability, but they may be instrumentalized by some political elite using media, new technologies to share fake news. So to conclude, I will say that there is a need today to apprehend Africa with nuance, beyond stereotype of distant abroad. And to do so, we have to broaden our perspective in order to learn lessons from relevant experiences that our diverse morphologies teach us, including in Africa. As underlined by the Ghanaian philosopher Kwasi Wiredu, who defines singularism as a local universalism, much work should be done in recognizing and incorporating episteme and experiences from the peripheries, if we agree that there is a core, but these experiences as legitimate contribution to better understand our changing world. And for me, to promote a promising future for African youth, one key pathway, in addition to accountability, legitimacy, is investing in education, but in education by taking into consideration realities and needs of each African country. Because this is another key challenge. We have to go beyond the copy-paste strategy, because realities invite to adopt a case-by-case perspective to really make sure that African youth can provide the best for the continent. And I see that in the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, which is in favor of a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth, there is a strong potential to use African youth as a key driver for development. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and I think you have managed to recast the different dimensions connected to state and society that are important to have in our analysis in order to understand the challenges of demography and also of democracy, as you pointed in the conclusion. So I think there are lots of follow-up kind of questions that we would have for you. And I would invite the audience to raise your hands if you have any such questions or comments. Yes, I see. Is there? Yeah, you will get the mic in a minute. There is a question downstairs. Yeah. Maybe first, I saw that question raised, and then in the back, yeah.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. My name is Carl Bjertness, and I have a company that wants to create jobs, added value jobs in Africa between now and 2063. Because I find that the demographic emergence is the wealth of Africa, is the future wealth of Africa especially. However, what one sees is socioeconomic entropy led by the current leadership, whether it's on a world basis or on the local basis. If we take, for example, we have a Swiss author, Jean Ziegler, who calls the three riders the apocalypse, the World Bank, IMF, and WTO, that were created after the Second World War to rebuild Europe and Japan. However, today we have to think about Africa, the fastest growing, and the only thing that will save our planet is Africa, because it hasn't used all its natural resources and so on. And with entropy among the youth, it's chaos.
Would you respond to that? Is it chaos?
Well,
should be on. Yeah.
Well, I will say that we need to be very careful in the way we discuss challenges related to African development. I do believe that the first responsibility to promote development in Africa is the responsibility of Africans and African elites. You mentioned these three international organizations, yes, in the past, they created a situation where conditionality should drive any support for African state. We see the limits of this model. But my point is that today we really need to, in terms of African leadership, we really need to acknowledge the need of ownership. The development of Africa cannot be made by others if, first of all, African leaders don't take it as their first priority. Because for me, being always waiting for friend partners, those from outside who will come to help you, show its limits. On top of that, you have all these challenges of what my colleague Daniel Bach termed chronic capitalism dynamics. If you carefully look at what is happening today in many African countries, you can ask the question, à qui profite le crime? And so I don't want to go further, blaming outsider. My point is the ownership is key today, particularly because Africa has a lot of resources, and I'm not talking about only natural resources. I'm talking about these driving forces, this youth population, which has a strong potential, but there is a need to have clear will, commitment, and ownership of African leaders to take and to value the best of these.
Yeah, there was the question there. Yes. I think, yeah.
Thank you very much for the very exciting lecture. My name is Paul Degila. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here. I'm from Nigeria. I'm working on something very close to presentation today. So, but I have a question. With my experience in Nigeria, the repentant Boko Haram members, when you take the demographic of these repentant Boko Haram members, I have never seen any one of them that is above 50 years of age. I stand to be corrected. Majority of them are the youth, just like you pointed out in your lecture. And when you look at the reasons why they joined the membership of Boko Haram, you will discover that, like you mentioned, it's not because they believe in the ideology of the Boko Haram. They join for economic gains, most of them. Now, if you are trying to talk to them to change their minds, there is a way they have indoctrinated them that they look at you as another comedian. They hardly change. Now, how do I, as a young researcher from Africa, who have access to some of these repentant, or who is interested in having access to some of these repentant Boko Haram, how do we change their mindset to and other intending members to tell them that, look, this thing you look at as economic gain is a potential disgrace? How do we change such a mindset? Then secondly, you spoke about democracy as that you said democracy elections. I don't think I've ever heard that a statement as powerful as that. Now, do we now say if they say the purpose of a thing is not known, abuse is inevitable? Do we now say if the purpose of democracy is not known for those countries in Africa where plotting coup is common, do we now say if the purpose of democracy is not known, coup d'etat is inevitable? Is it safe to say that? Because I have discovered that in a country where a family rules for 30 years, 25 years, those are the places you have this kind of coup d'etat. And if it continues like that, then I discovered that it's an abuse of democracy. So is it safe to say that if the purpose of democracy is not known, coup plotting is inevitable? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start with your second question about coup, and I have to be very clear that there is no space to make coup an alternative for strengthening African states. I can fully understand that after 3-4 decades, when the same leaders, the same families are ruling a country, well, people can start to say, perhaps enough is enough. However, it's not the best way to address this issue by making coup something very common, very normal. Because doing so, we are putting requirement for a sustainable state building in Africa very low. A state apparatus should be the manifestation of the will of population. And there is only one way to provide the opportunity for population to express their choice on who will run the country based on a political project toward the well-being and interest of population. I think we need to flip the perspective by thinking about how can we make sure that a democratic system, which is actually the opportunity of Vox Populi, Vox Dei, the possibility that the population selects a project, we have to make sure that in that context, first, elections happen regularly, so that the people selected by the population will be those really elected, because I mentioned this incredible tendency of plebiscitarian neo-patrimonialism. You know, there are now a sort of engineering of how to fashion elections and to win it. There are these experts now, they just use the string of elections because there is a limited, a very narrow understanding of democracy. Democracy means elections. But democracy, the building of a state, go far beyond. It is about strengthening institutions, making sure that you have the separation of powers and that there is always a counterpower. The very idea of the separation of power is about that. No one will keep all the power. If you don't make sure that you have counterpower, then you start to live a democratic configuration. So, for me, coups are not the solution. Because between you and me, if you look at coups which happened over the last month in Africa, and mainly driven by military elites, for me it is, like a game that the closer you are to the basket, the better it is for you to select best fruits, best mangoes, and pineapples, and so on. So it's not that these new leaders are offering a new social project. It is just because they were quite close to the power. They can see that power is sweet, and why not come in? You get my point. Regarding Boko Haram, very quickly, for me, sometimes I've been asked by some Western partners to share my views on how to deal with these hybrid and security challenges. And my point is, you cannot fight terrorism with ammunition, guns, and it's not when you send to any Sahelian country equipment, military equipment, that you will face an asymmetric threat, because root causes of terrorism, and you mentioned Boko Haram, I can mention Jenin, I can mention Al-Shabaab. It's not something around radical Islam or radical any religion. It is about the fact that those who join, and mainly youth, they join just as an opportunity. I've been privileged to conduct research with on this, and you can, if you talk with some young men who join terrorist group, they will tell you that there is no ideological or religious, the majority of them, and no religious motivation. If you are young in some way in the Sahel and you have no job, but someone come to you by night and promise what you can gain for 1 year, one day, you may decide to join. So to tackle root causes of this issue, particularly with youth, we need to invest a lot in education, but beyond that, to promote sustainable policies to create jobs. And I can make the sort of parallel with the issue of illegal migration. It is clear that, once again, it is about the lack of social and economic opportunities for this youth.
Thank you. We have a question here. Yes, and then, sir.
Hello, my name is Mona Brulhart. I would like to know, I missed, I think, the beginning of your speech. Because we're talking about demography, is the birth rate always growing in Africa, or is it also plateauing in a way that people understand to have less children that are better taken care of? That's one question. Then the other is the migration, the exodus of all these young people. Have you studied, like, for the future, the longer term, what that impact will be on Africa?
Let us take another series of questions. Yeah, thank you. Sir, yes, if you'd like to ask your question, and then you can answer to both.
May I add my voice? Oh, sorry, I think I should identify myself. I am Abdul Kadiri. I used to be the Nigerian ambassador and permanent representative to the UN here in Geneva until some 3 years ago. I'm now retired. So I thank Professor Degila for his very incisive presentation. I'm not going to ask him questions. I'll just make observations to which he might wish to respond to. You just made a comment now, which was the point I was going to raise with you, that in your presentation, the challenges, the causes, everything was domestic. For instance, we can't talk about social inequality without looking at the international dimension of social inequality between states. We still have what the Latin American economist Andre Gunder Frank referred to as the center-periphery relationship. It still exists today, such that countries of the north control the larger portion of the resources of the entire world. For instance, if Africa enjoys or has access to trade in such a manner that there are no handicaps. If you take the WTO, for instance, what obtains in the WTO? Africans find it difficult to add value to their raw materials, because the more the value you add, the more the duty, the tariff that you are required to pay before it gets into the markets in the north. So I think we should also look at the international dimension of inequality because it affects the resources available to our states in Africa. Two, yes, we have talked about the inability or the incapacity of the states in Africa to meet the people's basic needs. Yes, there are domestic causes as well as much as we have international causes. For instance, the Thabo Mbeki panel came out with its report some years ago on the humongous amount of money that leaves Africa, to the extent that Africa is a net exporter of resources, of finances. Two, we have had instances, for instance, if you look at the decade of the 1980s, from 1980 to 1990, which is often referred to as Africa's lost decade of development, was the kind of economic policies that the Bretton Woods institutions were imposing on African countries. Then the big issue is democracy working in Africa? Democracy is not working in Africa. What you have is electoral democracy, where just every 4 or 5 years, people come out and dance and beat drums and then vote for candidates. At the moment they are in power, that is all. Nothing happens, no accountability, no transparency, such that democracy, Western democracy, is not working in Africa. That's the truth of the matter. So what we need is democracy with African characteristics. I don't know how we are going to do it. If we are going to emulate the Chinese.
I think
it helps in explaining the spate of military coups in Africa, because democracy is not working. Somebody gets to power, the next thing he plans is how to succeed himself. So we have this problem in Africa, except we address all these challenges. And there are serious fault lines. These fault lines must be addressed.
Thank you for this very rich and insightful comment. I don't know, Eric, if you can make a very brief response, because also we are starting to arrive at the end of this event.
Thank you. Very briefly. So by 2050, the demographic trend will be up in Africa, to answer your question. And probably later it will depend. But for now, for sure, during the coming 25 years, the youth population in Africa will be increasing very, very fast, with a specific tendency to have almost the half in urban settings. So this is the configuration, which come with the challenges that I discussed. To very quickly react to Ambassador Kadri's point, the international dimension, indeed, we should take it into consideration. I mentioned the critical challenge of crony capitalism, and I asked the open question, à qui profite le crime? But once again, having said that, it is the responsibility, as a political scientist, if you go back to the very conventional theories of international relations, each state is motivated by its interest. So no one will come from outside to tell to any African country, listen, take care of your interest. It is the responsibility of Africans and African leaders to make sure that they design national policies to the benefit of their population. And now I think it's enough to always blame outsiders, saying that the problem is from outside. Yes, there are problems, but the responsibility to tackle this problem should be from Africa. And this is why I talked about the issue of ownership.
Thank you very much. So we have time for last 2 questions. Here and then, Your Excellency.
Okay, hi, my name is Ramata Franklin. I'm a former student at the Graduate Institute. And thank you for this talk. I just had a question about the notion of, I would say, maybe critiquing coup d'etat in certain contexts. I feel like there's oftentimes a negative association with this particular dynamic or this engagement, but sometimes maybe it's necessary to kind of problematize the way that we think about coup d'etats in different places. For instance, you talk a lot about maybe the African leaders taking ownership and responsibility of their own countries and their states. And I feel like in some ways, maybe a way to get to this point of ownership and taking responsibility of their own, I guess, situation is like a democratic approach towards maybe having all of the people choose this different way of moving leadership. So my thing is I think if people or the overall population are kind of for something, and that let's say they're for that particular way of ousting a leader that's not necessarily doing the work for the people, then is that not also some type of democratic approach, or having the people be the I would say the drivers of their social emancipation in some ways? I feel like sometimes we have to in some kind of de-Westernize the way that we think about social emancipation and approach to taking ownership and leadership.
Thank you. I think we understood
Okay.
the question. Thank you so much. Please.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this illuminating insights on one of the biggest challenges that our continent is facing, which is this increasingly accelerated demographic trends. As you've rightly elaborated, by 2050, our population is expected to be above 2.5 billion from 1.3 billion in 2020. In your mind, do you think that we have the capacity and the capability to respond structurally in an intentional way of these accelerated shifts? Secondly, do we have the policy space to address how impactful these trends are into the socio-economic ecosystem in our country? Example, water, education, health, employment. These are key issues, and also urbanization and the collapse of the rural economy, where quite a number of these trends, the shifts of the demographics are moving away. So I'm wondering, from your insight, what kind of response and integrated policy do you think our countries that seem to don't have the capacity nor the capability? And lastly, the challenge of the competing dynamics of the debt distress that our countries continue to face, where there is a competition between resources that are supposed to be utilized to respond to the collapse of the socio-economic infrastructure and are used to support refinancing and restructuring of debt. So where do you see the role of these shifts that are happening? And do you think that we need to do something in the dynamics of trade and industrialization and greening as a response to this very dangerous trend that we have seen? As you rightly pointed out, migration is just one big challenge, but the viability and the survivability, I wouldn't even say sustainability of our economies, but the survivability of our economies and the intergenerational mind shifts. How we all agree that coup d'etats are horrible, but the emerging trend of the demographics tend to respond embracing this dangerous trend that is rolling back demographic gains. These new trended demographics tend to embrace this coup d'etat. They tend to see the world and geopolitics in a totally different way. We've seen it in Niger, we've seen it in Burkina, we've seen it in Mali, and it is the shift demographics that have a totally different perspectives. How do we begin to address these issues? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, very much, my brother, for your great questions, and thank you, Ramata. I will connect your question on democracy and coup with the third question of Ambassador K, by saying that, and this is a very methodological perspective, we need to adopt every time a case-by-case perspective. Because, as I mentioned, Africa is very broad and complex. So I'm very reluctant with, general solution for everything. 54 countries means 54 unique situations, epistemes, realities, and experiences. But at the same time, I do believe that working on regional policies, and I start your first try to answer your first question. Regional policies is key because the African Union may be a privileged framework to design critical policies and to some extent to show the way on how to deal with this concerning issue of demographic trend. And as I mentioned, and please let me be optimistic. For me, African youth remain an asset because you have a lot of energy, a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation, including social innovation. I see, for example, how in some places in West Africa there are NGOs such as M Afrique trying to bring health to rural populations. So energies and capabilities are there. But the point for me, which is clear, is that to really take the best of that, we need political commitment. And political commitment is about strengthening state apparatuses in the region. So where to start? I think that we need to make sure that population selects their leaders. That's why I'm absolutely against coups. If population cannot select their leaders, it is the beginning of the end. But at the same time, we need to make sure that leaders who are selected come with a clear project to the benefit of people. Because what is today concerning, and the problem why people and youth tend to turn their heads in another direction is that they don't trust political leaders. When you hear what has been found in the place of this president, of that one, in cash, these incredible things, you can understand that youth, they are completely desperate vis-à-vis our elite. So, again, a need to provide the possibility for population to select their leaders, but based on a clear project for the general interest. You will ask me how. I will say that an important pathway is to invest in education. Because when people really understand the power of their voice, the power of their vote, then it will make a difference in the way democratic systems are improving the region, because they will select the leaders who propose a clear project which take into consideration all these complex challenges. I do believe that regional level may be a driver to some extent push for, and if you look at least on the paper, you look at what the African Union is promoting through the Agenda 2063, youth is key. Industrialization, as you mentioned, is key. Because if youth cannot have access to opportunities, job, then they will select other pathways that we know. Violent extremism, so-called, migration, and so on. Then invest in education, create skills and capability to really, push for a dream dream that Africa will really be a prosperous future is something very important for all of us.
Thank you very much. That was a very powerful message, and thank you very much for your inspiring talk. Thank you very much for your participation, both here in the room and online. And we look forward to meeting you at the next lunch briefing, which will take place on the 24th of October. And we will comment the results of the elections in Argentina and questioning the implications for democracy. So have a very good afternoon and see you soon. Bye.